Roasting coffee at home takes practice, but it's very rewarding. I've been practicing on a Fresh Roast SR540, and I've roasted some great coffee with this roaster. I've got several different videos up here you can see that talk about using the Fresh Roast. Highly recommend the Fresh Roast. It's a great roaster. But this week I hooked up Artisan to the Fresh Roast, and everything has changed. So I want to share my experience with you. First, how I hooked up Artisan to the Fresh Roast SR540. And then we'll do a roast together. And then I'm going to share what I learned from that. And it was surprising. So let's get to it. All right, first I want to share with you how I connected Artisan to the Fresh Roast SR540. There's several pieces of equipment you're going to need in order to do that. The first, obviously, is Artisan itself. It's free software you can download here on the internet. Once you get the software set up, you're going to be connecting Artisan, the software, to another piece of hardware, and that is a fidget, or basically it's like a circuit board. And this circuit board is the interface between the software and the metal sticks that we call probes that go into the roasting environment and read temperatures. The fidget is something that costs about $75. You can order that from fidget.com. I think that's the website address. I'll put a link to that in the description as well. And then you're going to need a few little connectors here and there, some wires that basically will connect from the fidget into your computer, USB or USB-C. Once you do that, then it's a matter of configuring Artisan to the type of roasting equipment you're going to be using. And they have a variety of different pieces of equipment, but one of them is called the fidget, and you'll just connect to the fidget and you'll be able to read your temperatures. The probes, these metal sticks I was referring to, they come in different lengths and different thicknesses. I purchased a longer probe and a shorter probe. I actually used these probes with the Be More when I did my Be More video. You can check that out up here as well. Different lengths are for different purposes. I wanted to have a long probe that would go all the way down to the bottom of the roasting chamber, and I wanted another probe to be short enough to be up above the bean mass. Really, I'm using two probes, one for exhaust and one for bean temperature, but in the Fresh Roast, it's not a drum, and we have air that's going throughout the entire system. So what I did was I used the concept that the Ikawa roaster uses. I really enjoyed using that roaster. They set a probe above the bean mass further up in the roasting chamber, and they called that their bean temperature, BT. And so that's what I did. And so on this setup here with the Fresh Roast, I drilled 2 holes in the top of the lid for the Fresh Roast, and I used the longest probe, and that went all the way down into the bottom of the roasting chamber, actually through the whole of the roasting chamber just a little bit, and it goes just into the base of the unit where the hot air is blowing out. This is reading the exhaust temperature. The shorter probe is set up so it's above the bean mass. It never touches the beans, and it's going to read temperatures further up above the bean mass as the roast takes place. That'll be the bean temperature. So what we end up with is a Artisan graph that looks very similar to a drum roaster. The ET, or the exhaust temperature, and the BT, the bean temperature, are both following each other, yet at different rates as it goes up along and goes through the roasting process. So we're going to see that here in just a second. It's really helped me understand more about what's happening with the heat inside of the Fresh Roast unit. Last thing before we get started, one of the things that I noticed, and I'm using an extension tube, by the way, and I did a video on that. It's a great resource. I would highly recommend everybody use an extension tube with a Fresh Roast SR540. You can roast more coffee and you get an even roast. It's a great tool. But one of the things that I've been learning, trying to understand with the fresh roast, is how these temperatures are being influenced by the dial that is on the fresh roast. This dial controls both the fan setting and the heat setting. And surprisingly enough, you can roast a whole roast on this roaster with a heat setting of 1 or 2, and go all the way through and roast some pretty decent coffee, just controlling the rate of rise with the fan speed of this roaster. The other technique is to build up heat all the way along the way, keeping your fan on full, and then as you roast and you get towards first crack, you start backing off the fan to increase your temperatures. So there's a couple of different ways to roast, a roasting style, I guess, with the fresh roast. But when we start to connect Artisan to the fresh roast and we start to try to follow a graph like a traditional roaster, like a drum roaster, everything changes. And so we're going to go through this roast together, and then we're going to talk about the end result and what that means. And like I mentioned earlier on, I am not an expert at this. I am still learning. And truthfully, I'm looking for your feedback and your experiences for those who have connected Artisan to the fresh roast and those who roast with the Artisan, and how they manage their heat and their fan and how that influences the roast. All right, so let's get started with the roast itself. All right, the roast has started, and I'm using the highest fan setting, which is a 9, and the lowest heat setting, which is a 1. This is how I'm going to start my roast for the first couple of minutes. And I'm doing that intentionally because I am allowing the beans to initially go through the drying phase, or at least part of the drying phase, and I don't want it to go really short. I'm looking for a 3.5 to a 4 minute dry phase, and it could be a little longer. One of the things, and I'm going to kind of, I'll let the rabbit out of the hat, so to speak. I'll kind of tell you the end result of this now so you can kind of pay attention to it, and it may help you. When you use roasting software, it can be a great aid. It can be an awesome resource to help you roast great coffee. But it can also be a distraction. And so I've roasted some great coffee with the fresh roast. I love this little roaster, but when it comes to Artisan, I'm questioning whether or not it's more of a distraction than it is a help. Now that I've made that statement, let's get back to this roast, and then we'll talk more about that at the end. So what we are going to do here is we're seeing what happens with this red line with a heat setting of 1. We get up to 375 degrees, and then it flattens out. So right now the roasting chamber environment, at least down at the bottom, the temperature coming out has leveled off at 375 degrees. It's not going to get any hotter than about 375 degrees at a 1 for the heat setting. The blue line that's underneath that is the bean temperature, and that bean temperature is increasing. It's increasing at a consistent rate as it is headed towards its goal of around 410 to 420 degrees Fahrenheit. We'll talk about that. That's the end drop temperature of the beans. That's where that temperature is headed. Looking at the bean color, you can see that it is paling and the coffee is starting to dry. That's a great sign. You can smell hay and like kind of grassy and drying grass smell right now with these beans. I'm making an adjustment here in Artisan because for whatever reason it didn't register the charge temperature, and so I had to go in and correct that because ultimately my target dry time was not being displayed, and so I had to go through and tell Artisan, hey, I started this roast at 0, and you have to actually say at 1 second, and then it fixes itself. All right, so now here's our rate of rise starting to come down from the top of the roast. We just hit, or we're going to hit dry end here in just a few seconds. Look at the temperature of the fresh roast. It is reading 375 degrees from the unit itself, and my bean temperature is about 325 degrees, and my exhaust temperature is about 425 degrees. I think that's interesting just to see the differences in temperature. That fresh roast is registering the digital temperature it's reading in its own digital probe down in the base of that black unit. All right, we've hit dry end, and that blue line that will start to descend again is our rate of rise. So the goal is to have a consistently declining rate of rise. You don't want a lot of this going on with the rate of rise, because it potentially can affect the flavor profile of the coffee. I've had plenty of roller coaster coffee, wavy coffee that tasted great, so I'm not quite sure about that. But in this case, what I need to do is I need to slow this descent down, and I have to make some decisions. How am I going to do that? I'm either going to increase the heat or I'm going to decrease my fan. There's two different philosophies that you can use with the fresh roast. You can manage your entire roast, as I mentioned earlier, with just the fan setting at a power level of 1 or 2, and you can get through an entire roast that way, or maybe a 3. The other way is to use heat. So I left the fan on full, and then I went to a 5, from a 1 to a 5 on my heat. And I did that, and you can see that the red line bumped and it went up, and then it started to level off again. And then what I did was I lowered my heat from a 5 to a 4, but I lowered my fan from a 9 to an 8, and then to a 7. And then ultimately now I'm at a 6 with my fan. And I'm trying to toggle back and forth between my fan setting and my heat setting to try to get this rate of rise to descend fairly smoothly. And you're going to see it kind of roller coaster its way down the, all the way down the graph. And the result is not really what I would consider a good result. And is it going to be because of the rate of rise? That might be part of it, but we'll get to the punchline here at the end. So don't leave, hang on. Okay, so I'm trying to manage, and you'll see that I'm constantly going back and forth and back and forth. I just lowered my heat setting to a 2, then I'll go back up to a 3, then a 4, then a 3. It's almost impossible to be able to get a good declining rate of rise. But here's my question to you. If you are using Artisan and you're recording something like this, are you able to get a really good consistent rate of rise with the fresh roast? Okay, not any other roaster, but with the fresh roast 800 or 450 or any version of the fresh roast. I'd be interested in you sharing your comments if you have been successful and how you were able to do that. I would like to know that. That would be helpful. I would appreciate it because I'd like to try to do that. There are some videos out on the internet. Home Coffee Roasting, I think, is a channel, and there's a gentleman that did a great video on trying to manage his rate of rise with Artisan, and he too was having these up and down issues. I think he did a better job than I did, for sure, but it seems to be a real big challenge to be able to do this. All right, we've hit first crack. First crack is where we have finished our browning phase, and we are in the development phase right now. And again, I'm trying to hang on and make all these different adjustments to compensate, because when you hit first crack, you have this burst of heat from the beans. The beans release energy. They call that an exothermic reaction. And so I'm trying to control this rate of descent, and you can see here that it just basically crashes and then it goes back up. Very, very challenging to try to get this right. All right, so we're at about 11%, 12% development. Look at the temperature. We're at 471 degrees with our exhaust temperature and 383 degrees with our bean temperature. All right, so I'm toggling back and forth with these different knobs for fan and for heat, but ultimately I'm getting close to where I'm going to want to drop this coffee because I'm focused strictly on my development percentage. I'm not really doing a good job smelling the coffee like I should have been, and I'm not really eyeing the coffee really well because I'm focused on the graph rather than on the beans. So we're at 388 degrees, 389 almost. Normally on the fresh roast, I'm around 425 degrees on the fresh roast temperature when I'm dropping my coffee. Here with the with Artisan, we're at 390 degrees. I'll be dropping this coffee below 400 degrees with Artisan. All right, my roast is finished and everything on the phase percentages looks really good. 42%-ish for the dry phase, 35% on the browning phase, and 22% development is not that bad. It's pretty good. I would have liked to have had it maybe a little different, a little shorter development. All in all, that looks good on paper. The graph looks shallow. The graph looks shallow as far as the bean temperature goes. There was not a really strong temperature increase to move these beans up through these phases, and ultimately, if you look at my bean temperature when I drop, it is I think it's too low because the end result is when I taste the coffee, it's not really good. It is kind of woody. It tastes underdeveloped, kind of hollow, and in a sense, I would almost say it's kind of baked. And that could be the horrible rate of rise that you see on the screen. It could also be the shallow temperature increases that we experienced, or the low temperature increases. So what would I do differently? I would definitely roast with higher temperatures, moving the roast a little quicker. This roast dragged on too long. Why did I do it this way? I did it this way because I was focused on Artisan rather than how I normally roast with the fresh roast, and that is by watching the color change and timing my phases. I'm not worried about temperature because I'm watching the color of the beans, and I've gotten some great roasts. Maybe I've been lucky, but I consistently seem to be getting some really good roasts from the fresh roast when I don't use logging software. When I try to use it and I try to get this descending rate of rise, it's a distraction, and I end up not looking at the color and smelling the coffee and watching the senses, the part of the roast, but instead I end up watching a graph. So I'm not going to blame the graph, but in a sense it is a distraction. So my question to you is, have you roasted with the fresh roast and Artisan, and was Artisan helpful for you? How did it change the way that you roast with Artisan? Did it improve things? Share how it improved things for me. I'd love to be able to learn from you guys. This is something new for me. Not really excited about using Artisan with the fresh roast. As a matter of fact, for those that are using the fresh roast, if you've been getting great coffee, I don't think you really need to go chase after Artisan. For those that like to fiddle around with gadgets and numbers, give it a try, and I would love to hear what your experience ends up with. There are people that are using Artisan with the fresh roast, and if you're one of them, I would love to hear from you. Tell me what I'm doing wrong. Give me, if you can, your recipe on how you're managing your heat so that you've got a nice, smooth, descending rate of rise. I'm not sure it's possible with this roaster. Again, the fresh roast roasts some great coffee, but trying to get this to look pretty on a graph and make it all work together, it seems to be a pretty big challenge. So share your thoughts on that. Thank you for joining me today, and I hope you guys have a great week roasting. We'll see you next time.